Welcome, everyone, to the Ecopsychology Café. This is a virtual forum for folks interested in ecopsychology and ecotherapy to discuss the relevant topics of our time. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel, and I'm the founder of the Canadian Ecopsychology Network, the host of this series. Monica Dragos and I co-created this program. Today, we're going to hear from Tanya Rodriguez and Pegi Eyers about the important difference between decolonization and uncolonization. Tanya is the executive director with the National Institute for Racial Equity, chair of Human Relations Commission for the city of Asheville, North Carolina, and an educator. She is known by many as a fierce Boriqua that speaks truth to power and is fearless in dismantling the systems of oppression. Pegi Eyers is the author of the award-winning book, Ancient Spirit Rising, Reclaiming Your Roots and Restoring Earth Community, a survey on social justice, nature spirituality, earth-emergent healing, and the holistic principles of sustainable living. Pegi self-identifies as a Celtic Animist and is an advocate for the recovery of authentic ancestral wisdom and traditions for all people. Thanks so much, Tanya and Pegi, for sharing your time and wisdom with us today. And now the airwaves are yours.
Thanks, Carol, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks for having us both here today. So I'm going to start off, and then Tanya will be speaking after my part, and then we'll sort of come together for a Q&A at the end. So about 15 years ago, the concept of decolonization began to appear in my reading and my research, and it was being used in a wide variety of contexts, both academic and non-academic, by both Indigenous and settler authors and activists. It was appearing in essays and activism in my local region, right here at Trent University in Peterborough, and worldwide from Europe to Australia and beyond. From these sources, I began to understand that decolonize meant to first realize who the colonizer was, to understand the colonizer, colonized, or oppressor-oppressed dynamic, to see how the individual and the collective both suffered from the brutality of white supremacy and genocide, and then to challenge the status quo embedded in that coloniality. So Indigenous peoples were leading the decolonization journey in terms of reclaiming their cultural and spiritual traditions, asserting their rights to traditional lands, reinstating treaty promises, and declaring the sovereignty to which they were entitled as First Nations. So for me, having proximity to First Nations family, friends, and neighbors all my life, these struggles for basic human rights were incredibly important. And I could not imagine that others did not share the same deep respect, care, and compassion for the first peoples of the Americas. So, of course, it soon became clear to me in my studies that our entire Western civilization was a colonial project. Or better said, that the colonization that happened on Turtle Island was rooted in structures thousands of years old. I learned that decolonization was both an outward process through insurgence, resistance, and action, and it was an inward process that meant examining one's own deeply embedded patterns of thinking and behavior, otherwise known as internalized oppression. The term neurodecolonization, created by First Nations professor Michael Yellowbird, is a perfect description of this process, and he requests that all references to the term neurodecolonization include an attribution to his work. So posing major questions through a decolonial lens about the foundations of the structures that we take for granted seemed to me to be ultimately liberating and sharpened my critical thinking skills in a positive way. I also realized that decolonizing was what I had already been doing my entire life without calling it decolonization as such. I was that annoying little girl who questioned everything I was told in Sunday school or in regular classes, and I spoke truth to power against any authority figure that seemed to restrict my freedom. In my own way, I've always been a rebel, and instead of taking things at face value, I continue to seek the cause and effect of why so many dysfunctional structures in our society are normalized. Today, we celebrate great critical thinkers, both men and women, but there was a time not too long ago when thinking outside of the box, especially for women, was silenced and repressed. So I continued with my decolonial reading and research, and what really sent shockwaves through my psyche was learning that we have all been colonized. What were the implications of that? Many generations ago in Europe and elsewhere, we all lived in societies bonded to place and fit the definition of indigenous as put forth in our time by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we all suffered that terrible disconnect from the land, our roots, our ancestors, and our spiritual and cultural traditions, as perpetuated by colonial forces that assimilated us into Christianity and later capitalist structures. I was able to fit my own struggles into the realization that unique societies all over Europe, such as my Scots Gael ancestors, had been colonized, and that the majority of the white settlers that came to the Americas carried this same colonial pattern with them. So, initially a source of grief, I've come to see the truth of my own heritage in a more objective way and to continue unpacking the toxic worldviews and assumptions of the colonizer that I never agreed to in the first place. So by 2013, as Idle No More was front and center here in Canada, I became aware of the key document, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, by Eve Tuck and Kei Wang Yang, that was appearing everywhere and being shared and quoted. Since that time, it has remained an important reference and has been republished, circulated, and discussed all over the world. We cannot understate the influence this article has had, and I was quite fortunate myself to meet Eve Tuck in person, who is now a faculty member at the University of Toronto at a decolonizing conference in 2016. From ongoing discussions on social media and in scholarship spaces, it has become clear that decolonize is a term that many settlers are using without any consideration of the context or respect for boundaries. Some white folks have acknowledged the key document by Tuck and Lang and have avoided using decolonization as a metaphor, but it only applies to First Nations theory, as it only applies to First Nations theory and practice. But one of the main problems continues to be that decolonize seems to be a perfect term for the work people are doing, both in native and non-native spaces. The terms non-colonial, anti-colonial, and post-colonial do not seem to carry the same meaning. For some reason, until the work of my co-presenter, Tanya Rodriguez, an alternative term was incredibly difficult to employ for some reason. Many white scholars, even though they are aware of the Tuck and Lang article, continue to use decolonize to refer to all kinds of activities. In my own case, I formulated a policy that I stated in the first printing of my book, Ancient Spirit Rising, in 2015. I will read part of it here, as it is interesting to look back over the years and to recognize that many social justice issues do keep evolving and changing. So this is the part from my book. As settlers, clearly we need to be careful not to use decolonization as a metaphor or combine it with other pre-existing agendas, and to be aware of how we use the term in any ideology or action that leads to the resettlement, reoccupation, and re-inhabitation that actually furthers settler colonialism. I use the term decolonization sparingly in favor of the phrase rejecting empire. And I focus on the principles of a paradigm shift to simple, sustainable communities and sacred lifeways for all people. So that was the part in my book back in 2015. I did create the term rejecting empire as an alternative to the term decolonization, but it did not seem to catch on. No one was really using it as I'd hoped. Anyway, later, when I fully understood the meaning of decolonize, I felt that the issue was so important. In 2021, I reprinted a new edition of Ancient Spirit Rising with all the references to decolonize changed to uncolonize. So even though it's true that a replacement or alternative term has been difficult to find, I am incredibly grateful to Tanya Rodriguez for her passionate stance in recent years, as she has been proclaiming far and wide that uncolonize is the perfect term to describe the work folks of many ethnicities are doing to unlearn our colonial conditioning. I have adopted uncolonize wholeheartedly, and I do not use decolonize anymore in my own work. So now I will turn the presentation over to Tanya so she can describe the intricacies of all these meanings and why people not actively decolonizing from a nation state have no business using the term decolonize. Okay, Tanya, over to you.
Wow, thank you, Peggy. That is, thank you for your fierce honesty too with your journey and understanding, um, where the shift needed to happen in your walk, and then making that shift. I think a lot of people will, might hear that and go, well, I can do that too, because it's not so difficult to decide to not use a term anymore that is at the expense of and incorporate one that empowers. So I think that that's a really beautiful thing and wonderful presentation. And I find myself blushing a lot in this presentation. So part of me, my face just jumps into a beet red because it's a big honor to be here and to participate in this discussion. The In 2018, after Ferguson, we started a group called Global Decolonization Initiative. And the group was an offshoot of decolonizing Bhakti Yoga. And decolonizing Bhakti Yoga fell apart because they started to go after pretty big yoga festivals and reveal them. And so the pretty big yoga festivals, they went after decolonizing Bhakti Yoga and crippled the group. And so they disbanded and they archived the group, and all of us who were fierce activists in the group were pulled into a group chat. And I had said that I had shared I wanted to start another group that opens up decolonization beyond just yoga, beyond Bhakti Yoga. And so a member and I got to talking, and his name is Satish. He coined the name Global Decolonization Initiative. And so we launched it. And the group, for the first, I don't know, about year and a half, was primarily focused in on blurring the lines between decolonization and social justice. And so if somebody was being racist, we would jump all over that person, or, you know, put screenshots and stuff up. And it was a really exciting time. However, a lot of the content was based in shaming people to wake up out of their colonial mindset. And so somebody recommended that I read Tuck and Yang's Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And then more people started to recommend that I read it. And as the creator of the group, it took me 4 times to read it because my colonial filter was so thick that I couldn't see the depth of what is in the content of that article. And when I finally got it, I said, oh man, I gotta do something. So we completely changed the focus of the group. We pulled out any anti-racism. We booted a whole troll factory that was in there that was pushing racism work, and refocused the group to specifically address decolonization efforts globally. And what that helped to do is to help bring awareness to all of the people in the group. If you go to the group, you'll find that we have a very low membership number. However, our very low membership number doesn't match how many people come to the group monthly. So our membership number, I think we might have like 8,000 members in there, 6,000 to 8,000 members. However, like 30 to 60,000 come a month to check the group out, because it's a public group, and we wanted to make sure that all of the information that we have on there regarding the decolonial efforts globally is accessible to everyone. One of the things that I found in the group is that a lot of people who want to honor Indigenous decolonial efforts often take on the idea that decolonization is possible for a person of the European diaspora. And so one of the things that I started to recognize was the root DE is to forcibly remove, right? And I'm like, wow, so we have people from the European diaspora that wants to forcibly remove the colonizer out of them. I said, man, that's harsh. That's really harsh, because that is DE is it's involuntary, it's brutal, and it's not something that is possible, essentially, from somebody that's from a Euro diaspora to decolonize on stolen land. So on the search for looking for another term to use, I found that un is a voluntary thing, and it's voluntary to unlearn, right? It's voluntary to undo, it's voluntary to unwind. And so we don't de-learn colonial values, right? We unlearn them. We don't de-do colonial values, we undo them. We don't de-wind from colonial societal mores, we unwind from them, right? Because it's a massive web. And so we put together, and I say we as in I, but I walk with my ancestors, so it is a we. And so we put together Uncolonizing, and the article Decolonization, a guidebook for settlers living on stolen land came through. And so one of the things that I noticed with this journey of giving work, right? Because it's work. How does one walk in a decolonial space as a colonizer without taking over those decolonial efforts of Indigenous peoples, right? And I think one of the best examples of that was last year. I believe there was a pipeline protest in Ottawa, maybe. There was a pipeline protest, and I don't know, I'm not entirely sure. I think it was either in Ottawa or in Alberta. I don't remember. And there was a bunch of Indigenous peoples there, and a Euro-diasporic woman comes in, and she has a big sign that says "Decolonize" on it, or "Decolonize now," I think it was. And the Indigenous people looked at her and was like, "Oh, nuh-uh." And I think she got beat up. I think she got beat up or told, don't ever come back here ever again. And it was a really strong example of how misconstrued and misunderstood the term decolonization is with Indigenous and your diasporic people. So to conclude, the efforts of the decolonization efforts of Indigenous people globally can be supported by Euro-diasporic people. However, because Euro-diasporic people who are living on stolen land are inherently colonizers, it is impossible physically, mentally, and spiritually to decolonize. However, in support of Indigenous decolonial efforts, Euro-diasporic people can work to uncolonize, which means to work through the policy that was created by colonial, but through colonialism, to make sure that the native peoples of the lands have control and agency and sovereignty, and can begin to reclaim what was stolen and lost. So policy, personal efforts, and things like that, spiritually, things like that. So yeah, so remember, Euro-diaspora people can uncolonize, not decolonize. Decolonization is specifically for Indigenous peoples to do in their lands. So thank you.
Thanks for that, Tanya and Peggy, and I'll end the recording now for conversation.